This is Chapter 5, Part 2. So we're going over some of the foundational ideas to get into some of the sociological approaches to crime, to explaining crime. This term here, we should talk a moment about social constructionism. In criminological theory, the idea that criminal activity is best understood by studying the processes through which behaviors are defined as deviant. So this is actually a little bit of an unconventional way of looking at crime. For example, the psychologists will typically try to, they look at, for example, aggression, which means intentionally trying to harm somebody. So they don't really study crime exactly. They don't focus on criminal laws. They focus on just the behavior that's intentionally trying to cause harm to somebody else. So and then they'll try to go look at factors that lead somebody to act like that. And we do plenty of that in criminology too. But there's an alternative way that we look at things in sociology where the focus is not so much on, well, why did the person commit that particular behavior? Why did they act that way? But instead, we look at, how the focus is on how is it that we have come to see that behavior as being deviant. And so the focus is instead not on the person who's acting in a deviant way, but sort of it's taking shining a light instead of on the person and shining a light kind of on the audience, the people who are saying this is deviant behavior or this is criminal behavior, and looking at how it is that we decided that behavior is bad and that we're going to disapprove of that behavior. And so it's some of this is also social constructionism. You can tell that they're saying, okay, that you're actually building something socially. And so it's focusing on how society decides what's right and wrong, and society decides what we're going to criminalize and what we're not going to criminalize. So it's focusing on that there's a social process in how laws get made or how people get labeled as being deviant or criminal. And so it also tends to focus on what this point that we made in the last section, which is that what we consider to be criminal to some extent or deviant to some extent will evolve and change over time and will be different to some extent from one society to another, from one culture to another. So there's some variety there in what we call deviant. And so it's not quite as black and white of a thing as somebody who's like the psychologists to say, well, we're going to study aggression and why people hurt other people. Well, the sociologists will step back a little bit and say, well, let's look at it a little bit bigger picture in that and say, well, why did we come to decide that this was something that we're really worried about and something that we maybe want to punish or that we want to stop? So it's a little bit of a different approach. A little bit of a less traditional and very much a sociological approach. Now, the more straightforward standard criminology, this is the scientific study of crime trends, the nature of crime, and explanations for why persons commit crimes. Now, that's a pretty narrow definition. It comes from the textbook, and it can involve lots of other things too. For example, studying victims, or you can study related things like gangs and organized crime syndicates, and also criminology does end up including a study of the criminal justice system as well, not just criminals and crime. So, but the narrow definition is break it down into the roots. Criminology, crim is referring to crime, and ology is the systematic or scientific study of crime. So in the narrow sense, that's what criminology refers to. Classical criminology. Now, the textbook kind of goes back to the earliest, what we would call criminological theories. And the earliest ones were developed in the late 1700s and early 1800s, around the time of the founding of the United States. And that thinking that came out of that period has come to be called a classical approach, a classical school of criminology. Now, you see in the parentheses here that I kind of have a little twist. I sometimes take a little bit of a different view than what the textbooks typically give on how we talk about this kind of theory. So realize that I'm going to give a little bit of a different take on it than the textbook, and you definitely want to stick with me when it comes to testing and all of that, because I always, with testing, will put priority over sort of my interpretations over those of the textbook, but I try to avoid any sort of contradiction or inconsistency or something. Anyway, so according to this classical approach, crime is the result of the perception that crime is profitable. So this point of view says that people are smart, that they think through things, they weigh the pros and cons, the costs and the benefits of an action that they're thinking about doing, and they go ahead and do it if they think that that behavior has a payoff. So the simplest way is, why does someone commit a crime? Because they think it pays. They perceive that it pays. Maybe it doesn't, but in their own mind, they perceive that it does. Now, I would say that this perspective also focuses a lot on the CJS there, meaning criminal justice system. According to this perspective, the criminal justice system poses an inadequate threat when you have a lot of crime in your society. If you look around your society and you go, wow, we got way too many criminals, way too much crime going on, way too much violence. If you were to ask a classical criminologist, well, why do we have such a high level of violence in our society? Their answer would be, it's because the criminal justice system is too soft. It does not pose a serious enough threat, a painful enough threat to people who are tempted to commit crimes to convince them not to commit those crimes. So this theory really focuses on the traditional theory, the old-fashioned stuff, focuses on the criminal justice system and how effective it is at catching and punishing people who are guilty of crimes. Now, that was late 1700s, early 1800s is around that time when you get the classical sort of thinking. Later in the century, in the 1800s, especially after Charles Darwin's On the Origin of Species book that laid out his theory of evolution, you got an approach that said, well, we want to look at humans, study humans like the scientists study all of the rest of nature, and we want to use the scientific method to understand people. And that the idea is, like Darwin put forward, the idea was that humans are a part of nature like any other species. They're just one species of many species, and that you can really study humans in the same way that you study other animals or other parts of nature. And so that's became to be known as the positivist school, which is basically a scientific sort of point of view that if you want to explain human behavior, it's based on different factors that are pushing and pulling your behavior in different directions. There's different factors that lead you to behave in a certain way, and that it's not really something that you freely choose without being pushed and pulled in different ways, because we don't try to explain animal behavior that way. We don't try to explain animal behavior in terms of their free choices that they're making. We see animals as acting certain ways because they're a particular species, and that species is programmed to act that way, and we sort of focus on all the different factors that lead animals to be like how they are, behave like they are. So we don't focus on free will when we're studying animals. So the positive school said, well, you want to study humans the same way, and that these different factors will determine their behavior. So this can be called determinism. You see it there in the notes, this concept of determinism, which science is based on this view of things, that you always have some factor that causes some action. right? Always something causes something else. So if you have an apple fall from a tree and it falls to the ground, well, the apple didn't choose to do that. It fell to the ground because of this force, this natural force called gravity, that was pulling down on it enough that it broke away from the tree and fell to the ground because of this natural attraction between bodies, and the earth, objects like an apple and the earth. So gravity explains it. So the positivist view says, well, we want to study humans the same way, that there are forces that are beyond their free will that are pushing and pulling them in different directions. And really, this is where I would say that the classical school often gets contrasted with the positivist school. And textbooks and professors will say the classical school says it's all about free will and free choice. But the positivistic school says it's all about determinism, factors pushing and pulling you in different directions. But really, I would say that these two approaches that look very different are actually the same sort of approaches, because if you ask the classical criminologist, why does the criminal commit his or her crime, the answer is not really, well, free will. They just chose to do it and that's the end of the story. No, they say that the reason why people commit crimes is that the criminal justice system is not posing a serious enough threat. They're not punishing enough. They're not punishing effectively enough. And so that leads a person to see payoff, and that's why they commit the crime. So really, the cause lies with the criminal justice system, and that you can bring down crime by making the punishment stiffer, harder, more punitive, right? So a classical approach is just the same as any other approach, is in that it looks at different factors that push and pull criminals. Here they look at the criminal justice system. A positivistic approach might look at, things like how you were raised, how your parents raised you, or it might look at who, were you a member of a gang, and did the gang turn you into a gangster, into a criminal? Or they might look at your testosterone levels, and did that make you more aggressive if you had a high level of testosterone? Or they might look at your genetic makeup or your brain, how your brain functions, and see how that affects behavior. So, and this is the reason why I put Hoskins' definition, is that to me these are all theories that have the same logic, which is something is causing you to behave this way, something or other. And none of these theories are pure free will, free choice theories, because if they were, they would say nothing more than, why is that person a criminal? Well, because they choose to. End of story. There's nothing else to say about it. They wanted to do it, so they did it. And there's no other explanation needed other than just free choice. All these other theories point to factors, and so they're all, in my mind, have a similar logic. And so I think that the textbooks have a tendency to make too much of a big deal between classical and positivist theories. Now, speaking of an example of a positivist type of approach is that you do see for a long time, biological research was not a particularly serious, or was not a big part of research, and it's still sort of I would say, a smaller part of the research than criminological research that looks at social factors, something that a sociologist would look at, like families or friends or schools or neighborhoods or culture or something like that. So biological explanations are still not most popular, but there's been sort of a renaissance in the past few decades of biological research, and a lot of, I must say, as someone trained in sociology, really sophisticated, impressive stuff that's hard to dispute, coming from genetic sorts of research. It's a very sophisticated field, and really accumulating knowledge very rapidly. It's hard to keep up with and understand the type of research they're doing in this area. But anyway, so you've got lots of different research methods that have been used over the years. The more old-fashioned ones have looked at families, or they've compared twins from the same family, either identical twins who are genetically 100% the same, or fraternal twins who were, who developed in mom's womb at the same time, but they are not genetically identical. They're like regular brothers and sisters in that they only share half of the same genes. Regular siblings share half of their genes, as opposed to identical twins that share 100% of their genes. And so, so a typical twin study will look and see if children who share 100% of the same genes, if they turn out more the same as each other compared to siblings who only share half of their genes in common. And so if identical twins turn out a lot more alike than just non-identical twins, fraternal twins, well, that's evidence that genes are having an influence. So that's kind of the old-fashioned way to study it. And also adoption studies, where you'll study children who are adopted into families and see if the kids turn out more like the parents who adopted them, or do they turn out more like the parents, their biological parents who gave birth to them but didn't raise them. And so that's another common sort of old-fashioned sort of study, is adoption studies. But nowadays we're getting to where we're able to identify specific genes. Humans have about 20,000 genes. Each of us each of our cells has about 20,000 genes, and each one of those genes makes proteins that are used to build our cells and run activities within the cells. And so this sort of research, very sophisticated, has been able to link specific genes with, things like criminal behavior, violent behavior, drug abuse, things like that. So that's the sophisticated stuff, because for a long time we didn't really know genes, and we didn't know specific genes and how to do that kind of research. But now this sort of research is just growing by leaps and bounds, and so it's really made a lot of progress. And so it's much more sophisticated than that old-fashioned twin studies type of research and the adoption research. And bottom line is that it's, for someone like me who's trained in sociology, we tend to be skeptical and sort of downplay the importance of genes and this sort of stuff. But just to sum it up very quickly, that research is producing a lot of very impressive, hard to dispute evidence that genes have a lot of influence on our behavior in just about any way that you can imagine, not just criminal type stuff, the focus of this class, but any sort of psychological characteristic that you can name, that you can think of. The research is pointing towards genes playing an important role in that. Not 100%, it's not, only genes, but that's an important part of the story, it looks like, which again is a little bit hard for someone like me from sociology to accept, that this other sort of different discipline really has some important things to say. But that's the way the evidence is pointing, is that this is an important area of research, and it's an important part of how we turn out like we do. That's a kind of a bottom line, if we don't have time in this course to go over all the research, but that's, in a nutshell, that's what that research is saying, is that genetic influence is important. Now, again, I use this term influence, where it has an influence on our behavior, but determinism like we have there in that positivist school, it's not that genes act on you as if you were a robot and you're programmed to do things in a certain way. It's not like that. It has an influence. And the way it influences is again, these genes create proteins. The proteins are used to run cells in your body and to build cells. And the ones that are most important for your behavior, of course, are your brain, because your brain is the organ in your body that's responsible for all of your behavior, all of your thinking, all of your feelings. They all come from the brain, and the brain is made up of a bunch of cells, billions and billions of cells, that are regulated and built and developed and maintained by genes. Genes are in charge of the kind of operation of these cells, which make up your brain. So genes affect your brain functioning, how your brain functions, and that influences your behavior. I mean, that's where your behavior comes from, is your brain. So powerful research there. That's pretty hot at this current time. Now, single genes have a little effect. So there's 20,000 in your body, and if you focus on one gene is not going to influence your behavior too much. You're not going to have one gene that's going to make you violent. It doesn't work that way. So every single genes usually have a trivial, tiny little influence on your behavior. It's almost nothing. But you have hundreds and hundreds of genes, thousands of genes, that all have a little bit of influence on your brain functioning, how you think, how you feel, how you react to things, how you perceive things. And so all of these hundreds and thousands of genes, with their just tiny little trivial impact, they all add up to really serious impact once you consider that there's hundreds of them and thousands of them that influence whatever it is, your behavior you're looking at. And again, it's all think influence on the brain and the way the brain operates. So hundreds of genes, really thousands of genes, work together to influence the growth, development, and maintenance of the brain, which is the organ that's in charge of behavior. You don't never act or feel or think anything without it going through the brain. That's where it comes from. And the genes have a lot of influence on how the brain is developed from the womb forward, and how it functions now, and how it's maintained. So that's a very important point. Single gene doesn't really make any difference most of the time, but all the genes together make a big difference. Now, let's see. Let's actually, this is getting long. Let's stop here and then we'll continue on to part 3.